Hello and welcome to Through the Bible in 10 years, maybe. We are in the Gospel of Mark, and we are in chapter 14. Chapter 14 is a very long chapter, I think 72 verses. So we split it up. We did the first 31 verses last week, or actually 2 weeks ago, and now we are going to launch into the rest of chapter 14 today. 32 to 72, 40 verses, still a pretty hefty task. So in Mark 14, this is the Last Supper, and today we begin with verse 32 and the basically the Garden of Gethsemane. So they've had the Last Supper, and we begin with verse 32. And they go into a place of which the name is Gethsemane. By the way, Gethsemane is a garden that is on the eastern side of Jerusalem, just across the Kidron Valley and on the lower part of the Mount of Olives, at the very base of the Mount of Olives. There's a cave near there. Wilbur Williams always suggested that perhaps they were going to hide out in that cave at night, or had been hiding out in that cave at night. Or actually, they'd been in Bethany the previous night, so that doesn't work. But anyway, Gethsemane, this garden where there are olives, and he says to his disciples, "Sit here until, so that I might pray." So there's a kind of differentiating of the disciples here. The broader disciples will stop at this point. And then verse 33, and he takes Peter and James and John with him. Basically, they're the second wave. They're going to be the lookouts, as it were, and pray with him. At least that was the idea. It doesn't happen. They are the inner core of Jesus' disciples, the inner circle, the pillars, as you would. And he began to be trembled and to be troubled. He's terribly distressed and troubled. Verse 34, and he says to them, "My soul is sorrowful unto death." My soul, my being, my whole, my life, my essence, my is sorrowful unto death. This verse has come to mind to me sometimes. I don't know if any of you have ever gone through times of great sadness, or perhaps if you've ever struggled with depression or ups and downs. This verse sometimes will come to me and resonates with me. My soul is sorrowful unto death. Of course, I've never faced anything close to what Jesus faced, and in fact, my life has been pretty peachy. I think anybody looking in on it would say, I'm sure that many of us who are very, very privileged can be very sorrowful, and yet we have such a good situation compared to so many people in the world. But Jesus is clearly deeply, deeply sad, because he knows what's coming, right? He knows what's coming. And, it's almost better not to know. I don't think death would be so bad if it happened suddenly. It's the long, protracted dyings that are the hard ones. But Jesus knows what's about to happen. And his soul, his life, his being is sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. This is what he tells Peter and James and John. So they're the lookouts. And they're also to pray in the meantime. 35, and having gone forward a little, he was falling upon the ground, and he was praying, if it were possible, that the hour would pass from him. Have you ever been in a moment like that where you know what God wants you to do? You know what comes next. The second hand is moving, and you know what happens next, and you just can hardly face it. You can hardly stand it. And Jesus, Lord, the hour, could it pass from me, please? Which shows the humanness of Jesus, right? John, in my opinion, does not show the struggle of Jesus. John doesn't show the real humanity of Jesus in that regard as much as, say, Mark does. In fact, there's a similar statement to this in John. My hour has come, and what shall I say? Let this cup pass from me? No, for this reason I've come. Dum, da, dum, da, dum. So John gives us the end result of the struggle more than and doesn't really tell us about the process of the struggle. Jesus struggles here. My soul is sorrowful to death. Lord, if it's possible, could this hour pass from me? Verse 36, and he was saying, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take away this cup from me. Remember James and John and said, can we be on your right side and on your left in the kingdom? And he says, are you able to drink from the cup I'm about to drink? And they were like, well, sure, give us a cup. You know, I'm thirsty. Well, Jesus is about to drink the cup himself. And he's wrestling with it. He's afraid. He's troubled. Take this cup from me. But of course, it shows that it's not a sin. It's not a sin to doubt. It's not a sin to be troubled. It's not a sin to fear. It's what we do with our fears. It's what we do with our troubles. That's where the choice comes in. That's where sin comes in. Because what does Jesus say? But not what I want, but what you want. And so Jesus submits to the Father's will. Could he have gone the other direction? Theologically, I guess the answer is no. But certainly he was tempted to do it. That's a theological can of worms that I won't dig into. Verse 37. And he comes and he finds them sleeping. And he says to Peter, Simon, are you sleeping? Are you not strong enough 1 hour to watch? To watch 1 hour. I'm asking you to watch for 1 hour. I mean, I'm sympathetic with Peter. Have you ever been just completely, totally exhausted? I think the older you get, the more you can stay up, maybe. Maybe not. I mean, okay, like not all-nighters, but seems like it's easier to do what you need to do for me now than it used to be. But this idea of total exhaustion to where you're out and nothing's going to wake you up. I remember some days like that as a teenager. Watch and pray, he says to Peter, verse 38, that you not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. There's another statement that I find myself saying quite often, because there's often times when I want to do the right thing, and I'm not talking about sin here. That's a can of worms. There is Jesus talking about sin. Theologically, I would hope not. But certainly there are situations where I know what the ideal is. I know the ideal is to do this now or whatever. But man, my flesh is weak. I'm not sure I don't think that's a sin. You know, when you don't take out the trash in the evening as opposed to the morning, or if you miss a week taking out your trash, I don't think that's a sin. But I don't know that Peter sinned by not being able to stay awake. Peter wanted to stay awake. He wanted to be there for Jesus. He just wasn't able in his humanity. Verse 39. And again, having gone away, he was praying. He prayed the same words, having said that he had said before, basically asking the Lord to make a different path. Verse 40. And again, having come, he found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavily burdened, and they did not know what to say to him. I mean, have you ever failed like this? And you want to be able to say, I'll do better next time, but there isn't a next time. And you just have to just say, I failed. I'm sorry. I don't know what to say to you. I really messed up. Verse 41. And he comes the third time and he says to them, never mind. Sleep the rest. Rest. Come on. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Again, this is the use of Son of Humanity. Son of Humanity here is an expression that I've mentioned before, sometimes just as a self-reference to Jesus. Sometimes it's a reference to Jesus in his second coming. Here is another instance of the Son of Man in reference to Jesus' suffering. Verse 42. Arise, let us go. Behold, the one who is betraying me has come near. Jesus knows that Judas has betrayed him, and now it's just a matter of timing, and now it's all about to happen. Jesus has been preparing himself. Now it's time. Verse 43. And immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, and a crowd with him, with swords and clubs from the high priests and from the scribes and the elders. Verse 44. It's interesting that it's a crowd. Are they expecting to have to face a mob? Are they expecting there to be some major fighting and resistance here? They brought a lot of people with them. This is quite a group, a bit more than the disciples, I think. Verse 44. And the one who betrayed him had given a sign to them. So he told them, okay, here's how you're going to know who the guy is. Interesting, they didn't know who he was. Jesus had been around, but apparently these soldiers from the high priest, they don't know who Jesus is. Judas has to identify him to them. Very curious thoughts. And so the one who the one who was betraying him had given a sign to them, saying, "Whomever I should kiss, it's he himself is the one. Take hold of him and lead him away safely." Okay. Now in Matthew, Judas tries to give the money back. Of course, we don't hear anything about the money here, do we? I'm trying to remember whether we've heard about the money in Mark. Okay, looked it up. They do promise to give Judas money in 14:11. So it doesn't explicitly mention the pieces of silver. Of course, in Matthew, he tries to take it back. But it almost seems like Judas doesn't want them to harm Jesus here. Take him away securely, safely. Interesting. Plays into some theories about what might have been going through Judas's mind. For example, was Judas trying to force the kingdom of God to come? Did Judas actually believe in Jesus but not understand the plan? Judas thought, if the Romans arrest Jesus, God will erupt into history and destroy them. What was Judas thinking here? Verse 45, and having gone immediately, having come to him, Judas says, "Teacher," and he kissed him. Verse 46. Now, of course, in the other Gospels, Jesus says, one of the other Gospels, you betray me with a kiss, but Mark doesn't record that. Verse 46, and they, having cast their hands upon him, they took hold of him. Verse 47, and a certain one of the ones having stood there, having withdrawn the sword, cut off the ear, the little ear, the earlobe of the servant of the high priest, and he took it away. I think it's earlobe, little ear, I think is the word here, probably. Of course, I think it's John that says that it's Peter that did this, but Mark doesn't seem to associate it with Peter. But certainly someone standing there does it. But that's not what Jesus is about, right? For Jesus, this is not a gunfight. For Jesus, this is not about killing the Romans or taking back over Israel at this point. It's something else is happening here. And nobody around seems to understand it. Verse 48, and Jesus having answered, he said to them, as upon a thief or a criminal, do you come upon me with swords and clubs to arrest me? Verse 48, daily I was with you in the temple teaching, and you didn't take hold of me, but in order that the scriptures might be fulfilled. And having led him away, everybody fled. So they're doing this because they're doing it secretly, I think, because they don't want a mob. They don't want there to be some violence erupt in the temple when Jesus is arrested. So they're taking him out quietly when no one is looking. But they're coming upon him like a criminal, and he would say, I'm not a criminal, I'm not a thief, I'm not a violent man, but you're coming on me like I am. Verse 51, and a certain young man was following him, having thrown a linen garment upon his nakedness, and they grab a hold of him, and he, having left the linen garment, fled naked. Now, this is an interesting little curious bit. Those of us who watch narratives and things like that, we always know that if there's a scene that doesn't seem to fit, pay attention to that, because it probably has some significance later on. And I'm not saying that the Gospel of Mark necessarily would have functioned the same way, but it is a long-standing suggestion that verses 51 and 52 are actually about Mark, that Mark is the young man, that especially if Jesus had the Last Supper at Mark's house, in the upper room in Mark's house, John Mark here, and that John Mark hears they've taken Jesus, and so John Mark throws on he sleeps naked, he throws on a linen tunic and goes out and is following from a distance, seeing what's going to happen. Someone grabs hold of him, he slips out naked and runs home. But a little bit of streaking in the Bible. But could this be Mark? Could this be the author of the Gospel of Mark? We don't know for sure, of course. No way to know for sure, but it is a long-standing suggestion that I actually hope is true. Okay, we'll find out when we get to heaven. So now we get to verse 53. And Jesus was led, they led away Jesus to the high priest. And all the high priests and the elders and the scribes are gathered together. This almost sounds like an emergency meeting of the Sanhedrin. Interestingly enough, in the Gospel of John, Jesus has a more private preliminary meeting, as it were, with, I believe it's Annas, before he meets with the other high priest. I'll leave that as one of the kind of tensions between the Gospels. It is more, it would be more natural to see this as a more private meeting rather than a full convening of the Sanhedrin in the middle of the night. That would be very, very difficult. But anyway, verse 54, and Peter followed him from afar until he was inside of the courtyard of the high priest. And they were sitting there, he was sitting there with the servants and was warming himself at the light. So Peter's trying to slip in. He's out in the courtyard warming himself while Jesus is being inside and being interrogating. 55, and the high priest and the whole Sanhedrin were seeking witness against Jesus in order that they might put him to death, but they weren't finding it. They're trying to, he preached loving of neighbor. No, we can't kill him for that. He overthrew some tables in the temple. Well, yeah, I'm not sure that's worthy of death. Verse 56, for there were many who were false witnessing against him, but the witnesses were not the same. Yes, I saw him turn me into a newt. Well, I got better, so that they weren't agreeing in their testimony against him. Verse 57, and certain ones having risen up, they were false prophesying against him, false witnessing against him, saying, 58, we heard him say that I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another one not made with hands. Well, that relates to his resurrection, but he doesn't literally mean he was going to destroy the temple. Verse 59, and not even thus was their witness the same. So they couldn't get their act together. They all want him to die, but they can't come up with a good reason that'll stick. Verse 60, the high priest, so now the high priest is going to get to the bottom of this. And the high priest, having risen in the midst, he was asking Jesus, saying, are you not going to answer anything? What are these accusing you of? Verse 61, and he was silent. He didn't answer anything. Again, the high priest was asking him and says to him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Now he gets to a direct question. Is Jesus the Son of God? Is Jesus the Messiah? Is Jesus the King? Verse 62, and finally, Jesus answered. And Jesus said, I am. There's the I am statement of Mark. I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. There's an allusion to Daniel chapter 7. This is the son of humanity use that relates to the second coming. Verse 63, and the high priest, having ripped his shirt, he must have already had a little torn. No, the high priest, having ripped his shirt, says, what need do we still have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What does it seem to you? And all the ones condemned him as guilty to be of death, worthy of death. Sometimes I think of this scene when people have already decided what they think. They've already made up their mind. You're bad. You represent evil, or you represent a wrong cause, and they're just looking for you to say something that they can use. And maybe you don't even say, you say some little thing or do some little thing that plays right into their skewed biases. And what further need of witnesses do we have? It's quite clear here that this person is a dirty, rotten scoundrel. We often do this with people from an opposing group, or an opposing political party, or an opposing position. Well, they all began to, now it's an excuse to beat him up. They began, certain ones, verse 65, certain ones began to beat him and to blindfold his face and to kind of mock him, saying, prophesy. And the servants, they received him with blows, or they gave him to blows. So they said, take him away and beat him. It's quite clear. Everything we thought was true. Go beat him. He thinks he's a Messiah. That's grounds. We'll get Pilate in on this thing. So that brings us to the last paragraph of this chapter, 66 through 72. And Peter, still being down in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest comes. Verse 67, having seen Peter warming, looking at him, she says, and you were with the Nazarene, Jesus. Verse 68, and he denied it. This is the prediction, right? Jesus says, you're going to deny me 3 times. I do not know, nor do I know what you're talking about. I don't know what are you saying? And he went outside into the fore courtyard, and the cock crowed. Remember, in Mark, there are 2 cock crowings. In the other Gospels, it's before the cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times. In Mark, it's before the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. So there's the first crowing after the first denial. Verse 69, and the slave girl, having seen him, began again to say to those standing there, this is one from them. This is one of them. 70, and he again was denying it. And again, after a little time, the ones standing there were saying to Peter, truly, you're one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech is similar. Your speech betrays you. Your speech is like him. So they had dialects. So you know how we can tell whether someone's from the South or from the Northeast or from various parts of the country by the way they talked. You know, the Galileans had an accent too. Verse 71, and he denied it, invoking a curse upon himself and taking an oath, I do not know this man whom you speak of. 72, and immediately the cock sounded a second time. And Peter remembered the word that Jesus said to him, that before the rooster sounds twice, 3 times, you will deny me. And he went away crying. Very sad for Peter, but there's hope for all of us, right? Peter ends up to be the first apostle, the primary apostle. And so there's hope for us, because none of us have failed Jesus, at least most of us haven't failed Jesus as much as Peter failed Jesus here. So that we finish up chapter 14. And so next week, Lord willing, we will begin chapter 15, where Jesus goes before Pilate.